And if you believe this message deserves to be heard, share it. The doctor kicked the black boy out, saying he knew how to save his son. But hours later, something happened that no one expected. Subscribe so you don't miss other stories, and write in the comments where you're watching from. The sun had already begun to sink behind the glass-paneled facade of St. Isidore's Pediatric Institute, casting long, sterile shadows across the marble floors. This was no ordinary hospital. Tucked away in the wealthiest district of the city, it was a marvel of modern medicine, a fortress of polished technology and silent efficiency. Every corridor hummed with muted purpose, every room glowed with the blue light of digital monitors. Here, the sickest children were given not just care, but strategy. Treatment plans crafted by teams of specialists, therapies imported from overseas, and data-driven hope. Room 404 stood at the far end of the east wing, quiet and dim, despite the sleek machinery that blinked and beeped around its young occupant. The boy in the bed, 7-year-old Lucas Haywood, lay curled on his side, small and pale. His chest rising so faintly beneath the hospital blanket, it might have gone unnoticed altogether. His face was smooth but distant, eyes half-lidded with a glaze that suggested he was neither fully awake nor entirely asleep. For months now, he had not laughed, had not cried, had not spoken more than a few soft words on good days. The disease had taken his appetite first, then his energy, then his voice. All that remained was breath and the reluctant beat of a tired heart. Beside him sat a tall man in a tailored charcoal suit. Dr. Peter Haywood did not look like a father. He looked like what he was, a man accustomed to being listened to, obeyed, revered. His eyes, a pale blue under rimless glasses, moved not to his son's face, but to the monitor above his bed. Every few seconds his right hand would twitch slightly, as if tempted to reach for the tablet resting on the table beside him. On it were lab results, genomic breakdowns, statistical risk profiles, and progress charts that ended in flat lines. Peter was not just a doctor. He was a world-renowned immunologist, a tenured professor at a prestigious university, and an advisor to pharmaceutical trials across 3 continents. He had published more than 50 peer-reviewed articles. He had been called a genius in more than one editorial. And yet, here he was, sitting powerlessly next to his only child, unable to stop the slow unraveling of the one life that meant more than all his accolades. He adjusted his glasses, exhaled softly, and looked at the monitor again. The numbers had not changed. The medication had not worked. The special treatment flown in from Zurich had failed. The experimental antibodies had done nothing. The top neurologist in Kyoto had offered to review the scans personally, but Peter already knew what they would find. Nothing actionable, nothing that would turn the tide. There was a knock at the door, tentative and light. Peter didn't look up. It was probably a nurse. They rotated so often he no longer kept track of their names. Some were more deferential than others, but all had learned to keep their distance. He was not rude, exactly, just precise, efficient. The door creaked open slightly. A face appeared, nervous, unfamiliar. "Dr. Haywood?" the nurse said, her voice soft. "There's someone here who asked to visit Lucas." Peter frowned. "A colleague?" "No, a visitor, a boy." Now he looked up. "A what?" The nurse cleared her throat. "He's a part of the post-recovery outreach program. Former patient. He visits some of the children, just to talk, uplift them. He's done this before." Peter's jaw set. He turned his gaze back to the monitor. Not interested. She lingered a moment. He specifically asked for Lucas, said he saw his name on the board. "That's a breach of protocol," Peter said sharply. "Visitors don't get access to patient information. Who approved this?" She hesitated. "It's voluntary. Sometimes the kids respond well to someone who's been through it. It's not medical." "Exactly," Peter said. "It's not medical, which means it's not relevant. I don't need a cheerleader. I need a cure." The nurse nodded stiffly and retreated. The door clicked shut. Peter glanced at his son again. The boy hadn't moved. He could have been a sculpture, a fragile piece of porcelain tucked under blankets. Peter leaned forward, brushing a stray lock of hair from Lucas's forehead. The skin was warm, but only just. He exhaled through his nose, sat back in the chair, and finally picked up the tablet. There was still data to review. There was always more data. Outside the room, the nurse stood awkwardly with the visitor. He was 12, maybe 13, tall for his age with a serious face and skin the color of coffee beans. His clothes were simple but clean. A denim jacket too light for the weather and sneakers worn thin. His eyes were steady in a way that unsettled her. "I'm sorry, sweetie," she said gently. "Dr. Haywood isn't allowing visitors right now." The boy didn't argue. He just nodded slowly and looked once more toward the closed door. "Okay," he said. "I understand." He turned and walked down the hall without another word. Back in room 404, Peter sat unmoving, the soft beeping of the monitor the only sound in the room. Hours passed like mist. He barely noticed the shift change, the quiet murmur of footsteps outside. He lived now in a tunnel of digits and dosage tables. Lucas didn't stir. When night fell and the window darkened into black, Peter finally stood. He adjusted the blanket around his son's legs and switched off the reading lamp. He didn't kiss him. He never had. He had always believed in boundaries. Science was clean. Emotion was not. He stepped out into the hall, nodding once at the night nurse, and walked toward his temporary quarters down the corridor. He would rest for a few hours, then recheck the labs. There had to be something he'd missed. There always was, if you looked hard enough. He passed the volunteer board on the wall without glancing. He didn't see the laminated card that read, "Jaden T., Outreach Visitor." Nor did he see the small heart sticker next to it, or the notes in neat handwriting praising his calm presence, his empathy, his ability to connect. Peter Haywood had long ago stopped believing in things that couldn't be quantified. And yet, in a different wing of the hospital, a boy who had once been declared terminal sat cross-legged on the floor of the playroom, teaching a toddler how to fold a paper crane. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. The children listened anyway. Jaden's eyes flickered to the hallway for a moment, as if sensing something distant, something quiet. He smiled, just barely, and returned to his folding. In room 404, Lucas breathed in, then out. And somewhere, something shifted. The morning after Peter Haywood dismissed the young visitor request, the halls of St. Isidore's resumed their cold rhythm of rounds, quiet code chatter, and the mechanical murmur of oxygen machines. Room 404 remained dim, as it always did, though the blinds had been partially lifted by a nurse who believed light helped with mood, even when consciousness wavered in and out like a weak radio signal. Lucas hadn't stirred during the night, and his vitals, though stable, gave no reason for optimism. His white blood cell count remained dangerously low. The inflammation markers had plateaued at levels incompatible with long-term survival. But Peter, sitting once again at his son's side, continued as he always did, reviewing, recalculating, refining. It wasn't that he lacked hope. He simply didn't believe in the kind of hope that came in the form of smiles, stuffed animals, or motivational words. Hope, in his world, was a line in a study showing a 5% improvement over placebo. It was an anomaly in a protein-folding model or a compound in a trial phase that showed reduced immunogenic response. Hope could be synthesized, distilled, measured. What it could not be, he insisted silently to himself, was a child with no degree walking into a hospital room to tell a dying boy that everything would be all right. But even the most rigorous schedules fray with time, and even the most fortified routines crack at their weakest joints. It was during Peter's midday absence, a brief meeting with the hospital's research council, that the breach occurred. A soft break in the system, barely noticed, like a skipped heartbeat. Nurse Christine had been following the Haywood case for weeks. She was new to the pediatric unit, on her third rotation, but something about Lucas drew her attention. It wasn't just his condition, tragic as it was, but the way he seemed to exist in a vacuum. No friends, no laughter, no joy. Even the volunteers, who usually brought a flicker of life to the rooms, had been kept at bay. She had once tried reading him a story, but Peter had overheard and asked her, politely, but with unmistakable finality, to refrain from unnecessary stimulation. "He needs rest, not distraction," he had said. But Christine had seen too much already to believe in that. She'd seen children with leukemia who smiled at clowns and lived longer than expected. She'd seen young girls with neuroblastoma who improved after painting sessions. She didn't claim it was science, but she knew it meant something. And when Jaden had returned that morning, quiet and polite, and said simply, "I'd like to try again," something inside her moved. Peter was gone. Lucas was alone. Jaden had waited patiently in the volunteer wing with his small backpack and quiet eyes. Christine hesitated only a moment longer, then buzzed him in. "Just 10 minutes," she whispered, though no one was around to hear. He might not respond, but "Thank you." Jaden nodded. He didn't carry flowers or toys or a guitar like some of the entertainers. He had no props, only a small notebook tucked in the crook of his elbow, and a calm presence that seemed to ripple through the hallway like warm air. He entered room 404 softly, like someone stepping into a church. Lucas lay just as before, motionless, eyelids heavy. Jaden moved to the chair Peter usually occupied and sat down carefully. He didn't speak for a full minute. He simply looked. Then he opened the notebook. Inside were drawings, not polished or showy, just rough pencil sketches of trees, stars, small animals, and children holding balloons. On the third page was a sketch of a boy in bed, and beside him, another boy holding his hand. Jaden didn't offer the book. He just kept it open in his lap and began to speak, slowly and softly, like telling a story to the wind. "I was sick once," he said. "I didn't talk for a long time. They thought I wouldn't wake up, but I did. And when I did, I remembered a dream. In the dream, I wasn't alone. There was light and warmth. I don't know if it was real, but it helped me remember what it felt like to be alive." Lucas didn't stir. Jaden continued. "Sometimes it's not about getting better right away. Sometimes it's just about remembering who's still with you, that your story didn't end, that it's still being written." He didn't speak with urgency. He didn't beg or plead. He just stayed. He stayed when the machines clicked, when Lucas's chest lifted weakly under the sheets, when the air conditioner whirred overhead, and then, almost imperceptibly, Lucas's fingers twitched. Jaden saw it. He smiled, only slightly, and then reached forward. He took Lucas's hand in his own, gently, as if afraid the slightest pressure might dissolve it. "I know, it's scary," he whispered, "but you don't have to do this alone." Christine had peeked in just once through the small window in the door. What she saw stunned her. Lucas's hand had moved. His mouth, barely, had parted. It wasn't much, but it was something. 10 minutes turned into 20, then 30. When Peter returned, he found Christine at the station looking unusually focused. "How's Lucas?" he asked briskly. She cleared her throat. "Same, but stable." He nodded. "I'll be with him." When he entered the room, it took him a moment to register that something was different. The chair beside the bed had been moved slightly. On the floor, barely noticeable, was a small pencil. A piece of notebook paper had slipped under the edge of the mattress. He picked it up. On it was a drawing of two boys sitting on a hill watching stars. Lucas stirred. "Daddy," he whispered, hoarse and faint. Peter froze. Lucas hadn't spoken in days, not even in response to questions. His voice now was weak, but unmistakable. Peter dropped to his knees beside the bed. "Lucas? Lucas? Can you hear me?" Lucas nodded slowly, his eyes flickering open for just a moment. Peter clutched his hand, stunned. "It's me. I'm here." His heart pounded. He reached for the call button. Nurses flooded the room in seconds. Vitals were checked. Monitors were recalibrated. But none of it explained what had happened. There had been no change in medication, no new therapy, no shift in treatment protocol. And yet, his son had spoken. "Did someone come in here while I was gone?" Peter asked. Christine hesitated. "One of the volunteers, just to visit." "Who?" His voice was sharp. "Jaden Thompson, from the outreach program." "I told you no visitors," he snapped. Christine's expression didn't waver. "He wasn't disruptive. Lucas responded to him. You saw that." Peter said nothing. He looked down at his son, whose eyes had now closed again, but whose breathing had changed. Deeper, steadier. "I want a full review of the security footage," he muttered. "This kind of interference can't happen again." Christine nodded slowly. Understood. But as Peter stepped out into the hallway, the paper drawing still in his hand, something pulled at him an unfamiliar dissonance. He had witnessed a shift. His son, moments ago nearly unreachable, had whispered his name. Was it a coincidence? A delayed reaction to prior treatment? Or was it something else? He looked back through the narrow window of room 404, saw the soft rise and fall of Lucas's chest, and for the first time felt something he hadn't allowed in years. Doubt. And somewhere down the corridor, Jaden was already walking away. Quiet, unbothered, unaware of the storm he had just stirred. Peter Haywood did not sleep that night. He sat in the reclining chair in his office with the lights off, his suit jacket folded neatly over the armrest, the glow from his laptop screen casting harsh angles across his face. The file on the monitor, Lucas Haywood Case History.pdf, was open, its countless pages of scanned charts and lab reports cascading before him in dizzying succession. Despite his aching eyes and cramped fingers, he scrolled back and forth compulsively, seeking an explanation that fit the world he understood. He replayed it all in his mind. The twitch of Lucas's hand, the raspy utterance of Daddy, the brief flicker of consciousness in a child who had, by every metric, been beyond reach. He tried to map it to medication timelines, to blood levels, to cytokine responses, but the numbers remained stubbornly neutral. There had been no intervention, no pharmaceutical variable to account for the change. Except there had been a visitor. Peter exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. Jaden Thompson, a name he had already committed to memory. He'd ordered the staff to pull the visitor logs, the hallway surveillance footage, even the child's volunteer file. The facts were unremarkable. Jaden had been a patient at St. Isidore's 3 years prior, diagnosed with a rare form of systemic vasculitis. Prognosis at the time had been poor. He had lapsed into a coma for 6 weeks, confounded the specialists, then awakened with sudden neurological clarity and unexpected remission. He'd remained symptom-free since. The boy had since participated in the hospital's outreach program, visiting children in long-term care wards, always with permission. No incidents, no complaints. And yet, Peter minimized the file and leaned back, eyes closed, listening to the ambient hum of the climate control system. For years, he had prided himself on clinical discipline, on remaining immune to anecdote and sentiment. His belief system had been forged in laboratories, sharpened through peer review, and tempered in conference rooms where real solutions were built molecule by molecule. But now, his son was breathing more deeply, eating again, showing micro signs of motor engagement, and none of it made sense. He rose and crossed the hall to Lucas's room. The boy was asleep, his face more relaxed than it had been in weeks. On the bedside table lay a half-finished cup of apple juice and a crayon drawn on hospital paper. 2 stick figures under a smiling sun. Peter picked it up and stared at it for a long time. The next morning, he approached Nurse Mabel at the central station, the one who had been assigned to Lucas since the beginning. Mabel was in her 50s, with cropped silver hair and a gaze that had seen hundreds of children and thousands of slow recoveries or faster goodbyes. She was not easily intimidated, not even by Peter Haywood. "I want to talk," he said. Mabel looked up, arching one brow. "About?" "Jaden Thompson, the boy who visited Lucas." She nodded, setting aside the clipboard. "I thought you might come." Peter hesitated, then followed her into the quiet room near the staff lounge where they could talk privately. The walls were decorated with colorful finger paint art, evidence of patients who had once passed through with more imagination than fear. "Tell me everything you know about him," Peter said. Mabel folded her arms. "You won't find it in his file." "I've read the file." "Then you've read facts, not the story." Peter said nothing. She took that as permission. "He came here when he was 9, she began. "Emergency intake. High fever, swelling, unresponsive. They thought it was meningitis, then an autoimmune cascade. Turned out to be a rare neurological inflammation that didn't follow any typical pattern. Nothing helped. Steroids, plasma exchanges. He fell into a coma. For 7 months, he didn't move." Peter remembered vaguely hearing about a case like that, a medical oddity whispered about among residents as unsolved and eerie. "He was nicknamed our sleeping angel," Mabel continued. "His mother came every day, sat beside him, talked to him. Some days she cried. Some days she just sat in silence. One night during a thunderstorm, the monitors all lit up at once, and the next morning he opened his eyes. Just like that." Peter's lips pressed into a line. Spontaneous remission. "That's what the neurologist called it," Mabel said evenly. "But when they ran scans, they showed reduced inflammation, yes, but not in the areas we expected. Something changed, but we didn't understand what or how." "And what about the boy?" "He was different. He said one word when he woke up. Light. That's all. But afterward he adjusted quickly. Physically, he recovered within months. But emotionally, psychologically, he was never quite the same." "In what way?" "He was quiet. Still. Sensitive. Not fragile, just tuned differently. Like he could sense things. He started asking to visit other children, not to play, just to be with them. And you know what, Dr. Haywood? Some of those children changed. They smiled, they sat up. One girl who hadn't spoken in weeks asked for crayons the day after he sat with her. Peter narrowed his eyes. Placebo effect. Children can be suggestible. Mabel shrugged. Maybe, but even suggestibility can save a life. He stood in silence for a long moment. Where is he now? He comes and goes, doesn't live in the city anymore. His mom moved them to the foothills a year ago, said he needed quiet, less noise. Peter nodded once, then left without another word. Later that day, as he sat with Lucas, watching him sketch a sun with uncoordinated hands, Peter found himself repeating Mabel's words, like he could sense things. The phrase nagged at him not because he believed it, but because a part of him, long buried, wanted to. That evening, after Lucas had drifted into sleep, Peter made his way to the volunteer wing. He found a teenager named Michael, who had worked a few shifts with Jaden in the past. Michael was lounging on a couch with headphones, but he perked up when Peter introduced himself. "Yeah, I remember Jaden," he said. "Kind of a weird kid, but in a good way. Quiet. Kind. He listens. Listens. Like really listens. Not to what you're saying, but to what you mean, you know? Like he hears the things you're not saying out loud." Peter stood for a long time, digesting the words. He thanked Michael and left. That night, he didn't return to the clinic apartment. Instead, he drove across the city to the address listed in Jaden's file, hoping against reason that they hadn't yet moved. The building was modest, worn at the edges, but clean. The mailbox for Unit 3B bore the name Thompson. He knocked once, then again. The door opened to reveal a woman in her late 30s with tired eyes and braids tucked beneath a wool cap. She looked at him with immediate wariness. "I'm Peter Haywood," he said, "Lucas's father." Her expression shifted. "You're the one who—" "Yes, I asked Jaden to leave. I'm here to say I was wrong." She looked at him a moment longer, then stepped aside. Jaden sat on the living room floor, cross-legged, organizing colored pencils. He looked up without surprise. Peter sat on the edge of the sofa, suddenly unsure of what to say. "My son improved after you visited. There is no medical reason for it. None that I can find." Jaden didn't respond. "I don't believe in miracles," Peter continued, "but I do believe in what I can observe. And what I observed is that Lucas was different after seeing you." Jaden looked at him quietly. "It's not about believing. It's about remembering." "Remembering what?" "That we're not just cells and chemicals. We're more. And sometimes that's the part that needs help." Peter sat back, stunned by the simplicity of it. The weight of his career pressed against him, an internal courtroom where data was the only admissible evidence. But here, in a modest apartment with a boy who once slept for 7 months and woke up with quiet purpose, he found himself conceding defeat and relief. "I want you to come back," Peter said, "to see Lucas again, not as a visitor, as someone who helped." Jaden nodded once. Nothing more. And in that small gesture, something inside Peter broke open. Not in pain, but in permission. He had spent his life building barriers between himself and the things he could not control. And now, in the presence of a child he had dismissed, he was learning to lower them. When Peter returned to the hospital, he carried not just his briefcase, but a conviction that perhaps he had been wrong all along. Not just about Jaden, but about what healing truly meant. Lucas was asleep, his drawing still on the table, another added beside it. A tree with roots going deep into the ground. Peter sat beside him, reached out, and took his son's hand. And for the first time in years, he didn't think about what he couldn't fix. He thought about what he could feel. When Jaden returned to St. Isidore's the following week, it was not through the side entrance or the back hallway reserved for volunteers. This time, he was escorted through the main lobby by Peter Haywood himself, who walked beside the boy not as a gatekeeper but as a guide. The subtle tilt of Peter's shoulders, the way he adjusted his gait to match Jaden's, the quiet nods exchanged with passing staff, all of it revealed a man who had shed the heavy coat of certainty in exchange for something far less stable, but perhaps more essential. For the first time in years, Peter felt present. Lucas was awake when they entered. He sat propped against a cushion, coloring a sheet from a book of jungle animals. His cheeks, once waxen, now carried the faintest tint of rose. There was still a catheter in his arm, still a tangle of tubes and IVs around his bed, but the boy looked up and smiled as soon as he saw Jaden. It was the kind of smile that carried memory and trust. "You came back," Lucas said, his voice stronger now, though still soft. Jaden nodded, his gaze warm and even. "You asked me to." Peter stepped back, letting the boys have their space. He stood near the wall, hands folded loosely, observing with a curious mixture of gratitude and humility. No longer was he the architect of every minute in his son's life. He was learning, painfully and beautifully, that surrender was not the same as failure. Jaden took the chair beside the bed and pulled from his backpack a small tin of colored pencils and a folded sheet of thick paper. He laid them on the table and opened the paper to reveal a half-finished scene. A hill, a sky, the outline of a child looking toward the horizon. "I thought you could help me finish it," he said. Lucas picked up a pencil, his hand trembling slightly but steady enough to draw. They sat like that for nearly an hour, saying little, working in a companionable quiet. Every now and then, Jaden would glance at Lucas, offer a short observation, "That's a nice shade of green," or "You made the tree taller than I did," but he never filled the silence with unnecessary noise. He understood, perhaps better than most adults, that some of the loudest healing happens when no one is speaking. Peter watched all of it. And something in his chest, something calcified over years of clinical logic, began to soften into something else. Later that day, after Jaden left, Lucas asked for a sandwich. Then he asked to go outside, just for a moment, just to feel the wind. That request would have seemed impossible a month ago. Now it became a goal. The next few days unfolded with a quiet sense of wonder. Lucas's blood counts remained stable, not dramatically improved, but no longer sliding. He began eating more, sitting up longer, drawing, laughing. The oncology team reviewed his case with clinical fascination. Words like plateau, atypical stabilization, and unexpected immune adaptation were passed around in hushed tones, always tempered with caution. But Peter, while he attended every meeting and nodded at every graph, had begun to listen more than speak. He held Lucas's hand during the infusions now. He read aloud from books. He stayed at the bedside, not as a scientist, but as a father. One evening, as the hallway lights dimmed and nurses began their quiet rotations, Peter sat with a pad of paper in his lap. He wasn't reviewing data. He was writing. It was the first draft of a proposal, a program to be integrated into the hospital's long-term care protocols, not to replace medicine, but to walk beside it. It would provide children with access to emotional companions, peers, survivors, empathetic volunteers like Jaden. It would prioritize not just clinical markers but psychological resilience, art therapy, music, presence, The unquantifiable things that might not fit in a paper, but which had, in this case, helped bring a boy back to himself. He named the proposal the Lucas Initiative, but on the cover page, beneath the title, he added in small letters, "Inspired by Jaden Thompson." When he presented the idea to the hospital board, the room was quiet. Some eyebrows rose, a few hands scribbled notes. One physician scoffed and asked, "Is this the best use of our funding? Companion programs and coloring books?" Peter answered not with defense, but with experience. "When my son was at his weakest," he said, "we had exhausted every medical tool available to us. It wasn't another drug that reached him. It was connection. We're not replacing science, we're completing it." The board approved a pilot version unanimously. Within 2 months, the program began. At first, it was just Jaden and 2 other volunteers, former patients, each with their own story. They visited rooms, they drew, they sat in silence. They asked questions no doctor had time to ask. Slowly, the hospital staff began to see changes, not always dramatic, but noticeable. Children smiled more, parents wept less. Recovery stayed complicated, of course, but the emotional tone of the ward shifted. Peter no longer wore his suit every day. Sometimes he arrived in rolled-up sleeves, coffee in hand, and sat with families without checking his watch. He still lectured at conferences and published papers, but he always mentioned one particular story, the one that taught him the difference between treating an illness and healing a person. One morning in late spring, a plain envelope arrived at Peter's office. No return address. Inside was a photograph. Jaden, a little older now, standing on a hillside in a denim jacket, holding a small lamb. Behind him were trees, and beyond them, mountains. Taped to the back of the photo was a handwritten note. "Healing doesn't always mean curing. Sometimes it just means remembering why you're still alive." Peter framed the photo and placed it beside another, a picture of Lucas, now grinning broadly, holding a plastic stethoscope and wearing a white lab coat 2 sizes too big. In time, Lucas was declared in partial remission. The disease had not vanished, but it had receded, and he had returned to a life that included more than tubes and tests. He went back to school in small bursts. He began drawing again. He asked questions, big ones, about stars, about time, about why some people get sick and some get better. Peter didn't always have the answers, but he had learned how to sit with the questions. And sometimes, when the hospital felt particularly heavy, he would walk down the corridor of the Lucas wing, the one with the forest mural Jaden had helped paint, and pause by the window that overlooked the garden. He would close his eyes, inhale, and feel the wind Lucas had asked for. It smelled of green things, of growing. And he would remember. The heart, too, is an organ, and some wounds heal only when we learn how to feel them. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next video or explore others on the channel, and feel free to share this one with someone who needs to hear it.